Hey everyone, how's it going? I am taking a quick break from my monster uploads to post something a little different. A first-time book reading, the Epilogue of Crime and Punishment specifically. I am recording this in late August, and as I have mentioned before, I already finished all of Monster. I watched it all in January, and will be uploading my reactions to the whole thing. But to take a little break from that, I wanted to upload this. It's a book that my best friend wanted me to read for a long time. She lent it to me to read over the summer, and now I'm finally almost done. I joked around with her a little bit that, oh, I should record my reaction to the ending of Crime and Punishment. Imagine me putting that on my channel. And she was like, that would actually be cool. You should do that. Because there are YouTubers who make video essays on books, literature, and all that. She wishes there were more of them, so I figured, why not give this a go? I'm not sure I'll have much substantial to say, because I've never really done a book analysis before, unless it was for school or university, and I have been reading this on and off over the course of months, so all the exact details of the book aren't necessarily the freshest in my mind, but I figured it couldn't hurt to make a little video about it, especially since I have been enjoying the book quite a bit and would like to have some sort of preservation of the moment I first saw the ending. As of now, I still don't know what it is exactly. I read the penultimate chapter, so I know that Raskolnikov goes to the police station and explicitly confesses to everything that he did. And the part I left off at was that confession, and I suppose all that's left is what comes afterward. Also, please enjoy this wonderful fan art I made of Raskolnikov after 2 or 3 pina coladas during my vacation. And finally, please enjoy this jacket I semi-ironically got for myself as an early birthday gift because haha, oh my god, monster reference. But also it just looks nice. Take this as an expression of my continued loyalty to and investment in Monster, and as a promise that I will continue to upload my Monster videos after this probably one-time break I'm going to be taking from that series. Anyway, let's fucking go. Siberia. On the banks of a broad deserted river stands a town, one of Russia's administrative centers. In the town is a fortress. In the fortress, a prison. In the prison, Rodion Raskolnikov, transported convict second class, has been confined for the last 9 months. Almost a year and a half have passed since the day of his crime. Alright, I did think that the ending would likely see him either in Siberia or dead. To suicide, probably. I couldn't really see anything other than one of those two things, just based on his character. The legal proceedings had passed without great difficulty. The criminal supported his own testimony firmly, clearly, and precisely, without confusing the circumstances or attempting to soften the account of them in his favor, without distorting the facts or forgetting even the most insignificant detail. That is surprising, considering how confused Raskolnikov tends to get throughout the book. But maybe it's easier to stick to what actually happened than it is to lie his way around, lie his way out of trouble. Maybe that's why he's suddenly able to recall things with clarity now. He related the whole story of the murder down to the smallest item. He explained the mystery of the pledge, the piece of wood with the metal strip, which had been found in the murdered woman's hand. He told in detail how he had taken the keys from her, and he described the keys and the chest and what was in it. He even enumerated some of the objects it contained. He explained the riddle of Lizaveta's murder. He told how Koch had, how do you pronounce that? Knocked on the door, and the student behind him. He recounted everything they had said to each other, and how he, the criminal, had run down the stairs and heard the cries of Mitka and Nikolka, how he had hidden in the vacant apartment, and how he had gone home. For the record, I'm reading a translated version that keeps all of the patronymics and nicknames, diminutives, and such. It makes the story a little bit more difficult because Russian names and nicknames are difficult like that. Everyone has like a million nicknames, but the translator's note in the beginning sort of gives you a legend for which nicknames belong to which characters. There's like a list of the most important / most recurring characters in it and which nicknames they will be referred to with. So I went back to that a few times and it helped me orient myself in that regard. I think it's good to leave that in, especially if you're a reader who wants to retain the original nuance of how Dostoevsky crafted the dynamics between each character and the dialogue between them. Like choosing to use a nickname versus a patronymic versus someone's full name and so on is part of the story in a way, if you're looking for that depth of nuance in how the characters view each other, how they speak to each other, relate to each other, and all that. He pointed out in conclusion the stone in the yard on Voznesensky Prospect. under which the purse and other items were found. In brief, the case was clear. The investigators and judges were quite surprised that he had not made use of the purse and other items, but had hidden them under a stone, and even more so that he could not remember in detail all the items he had stolen, and was even wrong about how many there were. In particular, the statement that he had not once opened the purse, and did not even know how much money there was in it, seemed improbable. There turned out to be 317 silver rubles and 3 20-kopeck pieces. Some of the larger bills, which had been on top, had gotten quite moldy from lying under the stone. A long time was spent trying to find out why the accused had lied about this one circumstance, when he had correctly and of his own free will confirmed everything else. There were, finally, some, the psychologists especially, who even admitted he really might not have looked into the purse, and so didn't know what was in it, and since he hadn't known, had hidden it away under the stone. For this very reason, however, they concluded that the crime itself could not have been committed except in a fit of temporary insanity, so to speak, while the criminal was pathologically obsessed with murder and robbery without any further aims or calculations of personal gain. This seems pretty accurate, depending on how you define temporary, because Raskolnikov's quote-unquote insanity had been brewing for quite some time, like at least a month or two, maybe even more. He was obviously very unwell, and there's obviously a lot to say about Raskolnikov that I'm not saying right now, but his crime is like a very intriguing mix of planned, calculated, and yet still a crime of passion at the same time. Like, it's not entirely cold-blooded, but it's not entirely in the moment either. It's a very interesting combination of the two. Incidentally, this was supported by the recently fashionable theory of temporary insanity, which is applied so often in our time. Moreover, Raskolnikov's former depressive condition was attested to in detail by many witnesses, by Dr. Zosimov, by his former friends, by his landlady, by the maid. Oh wow. It greatly facilitated the conclusion that Raskolnikov was not quite an ordinary murderer, criminal, and thief, and that his was a somewhat different case. That's an interesting thing to say, because one of the main points of this story, at least that I got, especially from the detective Porfiry, is that there is no real ordinary case or ordinary criminal. Each case and criminal is unique in its own right. To the great annoyance of those who advanced this opinion, the criminal scarcely tried to defend himself, of course. That seems very in character, somehow, at this point, even though he wrote a whole report about why his theory is correct, that some people, presumably including himself, have the right to kill, have the right to decide which lives to snuff out for the progression of humanity or whatever. But I guess by now he's fully come to the conclusion that either his theory is wrong, or he just is not one of those types of people outlined in his theory. It's very ubermenschy and uncomfortable. Raskolnikov in general is very uncomfortable to read about, but very fascinating as well. In response to the final questions, what exactly could have inclined him to murder, and what prompted him to commit robbery, he replied quite clearly and with the crudest precision that his motive had been his bad situation, his poverty and helplessness, his desire to firm the foundations of his career with the help of the at least 3,000 rubles that he had expected to find at the murdered woman's. He had decided on murder because of his weak and irresponsible character, exasperated, moreover, by privations and failures. When asked what had impelled him to declare his guilt, he replied he was sincerely repentant. All this was almost too crude, and yet the sentence proved more merciful than could have been expected, given the nature of the crime. And this may have been because the criminal not only made no attempt to justify himself, but even seemed to want to inculpate himself still further. All the strange and special circumstances of the case were taken into account. There was not the slightest doubt of the criminal's pathological and destitute condition in the period before the crime was committed. The circumstances surrounding the accidental murder of Lizaveta actually served to support the latter hypothesis. A man in the process of committing 2 murders forgets that the door is wide open. Finally, he confessed at a time when the case had become unusually tangled as a result of the false confession made in a fit of depression by the religious fanatic, Nikolai, when there was no clear evidence and almost no suspicion as to the real criminal. Porfiry Petrovich had fully kept his word. I liked Porfiry a lot, by the way. One of my favorite characters for sure. Besides Razumihin, I think that's how you pronounce it. All this definitely helped to soften the lot of the accused. There were some other circumstances that came up quite unexpectedly, and these two favored the man on trial. I'm wondering if Sonia is going to be mentioned. The former student Razumihin dug up the information somewhere and testified to the effect that the prisoner Raskolnikov, when he had been at the university, had used his last resources to help a poor, consumptive fellow student, and had practically supported him over a period of 6 months. Oof, I don't remember this. Is this only being revealed now? I think it is. When the student died, Raskolnikov had looked after his old invalid father, who was still alive and whom the dead student had supported and kept by his own efforts almost since the age of 13. And Raskolnikov had finally placed this old man in a hospital, and when he too had died, Raskolnikov had paid for his funeral. This is similar to him paying for Marmeladov's funeral. He has a thing for paying for funerals, doesn't he? All this information had a certain favorable effect on the determination of Raskolnikov's fate, and his former landlady, the mother of his dead fiancée, the widow Zarnitsyn, attested that when they had been living in their other house, the one at Five Corners, a fire had once broken out at night, and he had rescued 2 small children from an apartment that was already in flames, and he had gotten himself scorched in the process. It was investigated assiduously and turned out to be well attested by many witnesses. This is all very interesting and sort of surprising, but not really, I guess. In brief, the trial ended with a sentence to hard labor of the 2nd degree, for a period of only 8 years in all, the court having considered his confession and the circumstances mitigating his guilt. That's not as depressing as I would have expected. Obviously, I'm not finished yet, but I was expecting this to end either in suicide or like life in prison. I thought he would be in Siberia forever, or at least for a lot longer than 8 years. It's also interesting that so many of the other characters are standing up for him in court. That's a little bit more than I was expecting. For some reason, I was expecting the confession to go over so badly that so many of these people would not even want to talk to him anymore or defend him at all in any way. It's very interesting. At the very beginning of the trial, Raskolnikov's mother took sick. Dunya is also one of my favorites. Dunya is awesome. Dunya and Razumihin found it necessary to remove her from Petersburg for the duration of the trial. Probably for the best. Razumihin chose a town along the railroad not far from Petersburg so he could keep up regularly with the course of the trial and at the same time see Avdotia Romanovna as often as possible. Pulcheria Alexandrovna turned out to have some rather peculiar nervous ailment that was accompanied by mental derangement, if not constantly, at least from time to time. When Dunya had returned from her last meeting with her brother, she found her mother quite sick, feverish and delirious. Oh shit, does this run in the family? Though in all seriousness, it's very understandable considering everything her son has been through. That same evening, she consulted Razumihin on how to reply to her mother's inquiries about Raskolnikov, and for her mother's sake, the two of them invented a whole story about Raskolnikov's departure for one of Russia's distant borders on a private commission, which in the long run would bring him both fame and money. Interesting, but how long would they be able to keep that secret, if at all? They were nevertheless struck by the fact that Pulcheria Alexandrovna never questioned them about it, either then or later. I wonder if she secretly knows that they're lying and is just going along with this anyway because it makes her feel better. On the contrary, she too seemed to have a whole story at hand about her son's sudden departure. In tears, she would tell how he had come to bid her goodbye. At the same time, she let it be known by insinuations that many important and mysterious circumstances were known to her alone. Rodia had many powerful enemies, and he even had to go into hiding for a while. As for his future career, she too thought it would undoubtedly be brilliant, as soon as certain hostile circumstances improved. She assured Razumihin her son would in time be a person of some importance to the state, as his brilliant essay and his literary flair already indicated. This essay she read constantly, sometimes even aloud. She went to bed with it practically beside her. This is really sad. And yet she almost never asked where Rodia really was, in spite of the fact that it was obvious they avoided the subject in her presence, which in itself might well have aroused her suspicion. At last, they began to worry about Pulcheria Alexandrovna's strange silence on several points. She did not, for example, complain that he didn't write letters, whereas formerly, with Raskolnikov in Petersburg, she had lived in the sole expectation of receiving a letter soon from her beloved Rodia. This latter circumstance seemed completely inexplicable and greatly disturbed Dunya. The thought occurred to her that her mother had a sense of something awful in her son's fate, and feared to inquire because she might discover something even more awful. Anyway, Dunya saw clearly that Pulcheria Alexandrovna was not in sound mind. This is pretty in character for her too. Like throughout the story, she was obviously prone to becoming very nervous sometimes, and similar to Catherine Ivanovna, the wife of Marmeladov, she's shown a tendency to sort of make things up in order to comfort herself. Like Catherine Ivanovna would make things up about her husband or her children or her family's situation in general, like to the point of delusion, as a way to comfort herself. I would say that Pulcheria Alexandrovna is still a lot more likable and very different in many ways, but the similarity is there in that both of them are very desperate mothers, driven at this point to the point of delirium and finding solace in almost deluding themselves with fantasies of future greatness, either for themselves or members of their family. And we've actually seen Raskolnikov's mother do something similar before. She would constantly assure herself and assure others around her, though maybe to a lesser degree than right now, that her son is brilliant and he has a wonderful career ahead of him, and so they should be patient with him wanting to be alone for a while, for him not contacting them. Like, it's such an obvious and painful cope that she's doing, and it's really hard to read about. It makes me feel sad. This whole book is so depressing, honestly, but I love it a lot. Like, it is very realistic, and there's a lot of raw compassion in it, in a way that you can't really see with narratives that are more lighthearted. I'll probably ramble about this more later, but in many ways, darker narratives have room for expressing a certain kind of hope or a certain kind of light that carries more weight than something like that ever could in a narrative where there isn't something so dark to contrast it. It's just a very raw book. Several times, however, she herself would lead the conversation to a point where, if one answered her, it would be impossible not to refer at least to Rodia's whereabouts. When the answers, willy-nilly, turned out to be unsatisfactory or suspicious, she would turn suddenly very sad, gloomy, and taciturn, a mood that would last a very long time. Dunya saw at last how difficult it was to go on lying and improvising, and concluded it was better, on certain points, to keep silent altogether. Still, it became clearer and clearer until it was obvious that her poor mother suspected something awful. Dunya recalled her brother's mentioning that Pulcheria Alexandrovna had heard her talk in her sleep the night before that last fateful day, after her encounter with Svidrigailov. What had she heard? Sometimes after several days or even weeks of morose, gloomy silence and mute weeping, the patient would become rather hysterically animated and would all of a sudden start talking, and almost never stop, about her son, about her hopes for his future. Oh my god. Sometimes her fantasies were quite strange. They humored her, they agreed with her. She herself may have seen clearly they were only humoring her, and yet she went on talking. Bro. 5 months after the prisoner's confession, he was sentenced. Razumihin, whenever possible, went to see him in prison, and Sonia too. Okay, there Sonia is. At last it came time to part. Dunya promised her brother it would not be permanent, and so did Razumihin. In the latter's youthful, active brain, a project had already taken shape, of spending the next 3 or 4 years acquiring the basis of a fortune, and after a certain amount of money had been accumulated, moving to Siberia, where the soil was fertile but people and capital were scarce, settling in the town where Rodia would be, and they could all begin a new life together. When they said goodbye, they all wept. Raskolnikov had brooded a great deal these last days. Finally, a little bit more about him. I say that in the book, which is 90% just Raskolnikov's inner monologues, but anyway. He inquired about his mother and worried about her constantly. He even seemed to suffer a good deal on her account, to Dunya's alarm. Learning in detail of his mother's illness, he became very gloomy. Yeah, it's pretty obvious throughout the book, like, despite all his fucked up problems and such, I think he does care for his family a lot, his sister and his mother. With Sonia, he was for some reason particularly uncommunicative the whole time. She had been making plans for some time, with the help of the money Svidrigailov had given her, to follow the convict gang in which he was being dispatched. It never came up between Raskolnikov and her, but they both knew that's the way it would be. During their farewell meeting, he smiled strangely in response to his sister's and Razumihin's fervent assurances about their happy future together when he got out of prison, and predicted his mother's illness would soon end in disaster. At last he and Sonia set off. I swear to God, if this still ends with him committing suicide. 2 months later, Dunya and Razumihin got married. Oh, nice. I don't mind that. The wedding was quiet and sad. Porfiry Petrovich and Zosimov were among the guests. All this time, Razumihin had worn the look of a determined man. Dunya believed blindly in all his projects. Indeed, she could not help but believe in them. His iron will was there to be seen. He began attending lectures at the university again, to finish his course of studies. They both made plans for the future. firmly reckoning on moving to Siberia within 5 years. Until then, they were relying on Sonia. Pulcheria Alexandrovna gladly gave her blessing to her daughter's marriage, but after it took place, she seemed to grow even sadder and more preoccupied. In order to afford her a moment's pleasure, Razumihin told her about the sick student and his father, and how Rodya had been burned and even laid up for a while after saving 2 children from their death the year before. Both these items of information sent the already disturbed Pulcheria Alexandrovna practically into raptures. Oh shit. She talked about them all the time, entering into conversation on the subject on the street or anywhere, even though Dunya always accompanied her. No sooner did she secure a listener of any kind, in a public conveyance, in a shop, anywhere, then she brought the conversation around to her son, his article, how he had helped the student, how he had burned in a fire, and so on. Oh my god, I don't know why this in particular is so depressing, just seeing how his mother's falling apart over all this. Like, she so clearly wants to believe in him so badly. It's heartbreaking. Dunya did not know how to restrain her. In addition to the dangers of overexcitement, there was the possibility someone might recall the name Raskolnikov from the recent trial and mention it. Pulcheria Alexandrovna even discovered the address of the mother of the 2 children who had been saved from the fire, and she determined to go see her. At last her disturbance reached an extreme. She would break suddenly into tears at times. She fell ill frequently and would become feverishly delirious. One morning she declared forthrightly that Rodya would be back soon according to her calculations. When they had said goodbye, he had told her to expect him back in 9 months. She started cleaning up the apartment. Getting it ready for their reunion, she got a room ready for him, her own, and dusted the furniture and washed and hung out a new set of curtains, and so on. Though alarmed, Dunya said nothing and even helped get the room ready to welcome her brother. After an alarming day given to fantasies, happy delusions, and tears, she took sick. By morning she was running a temperature and was delirious. A fever set in. Oh shit! Within 2 weeks she died. In her delirium, she uttered words indicating she surmised more about her son's awful fate than they had suspected. Oh my gosh, I had a feeling that would happen, especially after all this description of how ill she was. That's depressing. Raskolnikov did not learn of his mother's death for a long time, even though he had been in touch with Petersburg from the very beginning of his settlement in Siberia. It was arranged through Sonia, who wrote to Razumikhin's address in Petersburg punctually every month, and every month received a punctual reply. To Dunya and Razumikhin, Sonia's letters seemed at first a bit dry and unsatisfactory. Later, however, they found the letters could not have been better, for they provided the fullest possible and most precise account of their unfortunate brother's lot. Sonia's letters contained the most ordinary, everyday events, a very simple and clear description of Raskolnikov's surroundings in convict exile. Nor did she include an account of her own hopes or doubts about the future, nor of her own feelings. Instead of attempting to interpret his spiritual condition and inner life, she related facts only. His own words, for example, detailed information about his health, what exactly he seemed to want at the time she had last seen him, what he had asked her to do, and so on. It's probably better that way, actually. Just relaying the facts of what she's seeing and letting them reach their own conclusions about it or make their own interpretations about it. I mean, after all, they are his family. They know him better than she does. All this was communicated in great detail. In the end, the image of their unfortunate brother seemed to emerge of itself, clearly and precisely drawn. Since it was based on solid fact, there could be no mistake. Yet Dunya and her husband could draw but cold comfort from this information, especially at first. Sonia wrote that he was perpetually gloomy, taciturn, and scarcely even interested in the news she told him every time she saw him, as culled from the letters she received, that he asked about his mother from time to time, and that when she saw he seemed to surmise the truth, she told him finally of his mother's death. And to her surprise, even this news had no very strong effect on him, or at least so it seemed, as far as she could judge by external appearances. But she did write that in spite of the fact he seemed so self-absorbed and somehow shut off from everybody, his attitude to his new life was straightforward and direct. He clearly understood his position, expected nothing better in the near future, had none of the frivolous hopes so common to men in his shoes, and was surprised by hardly any of the circumstances of his new environment. So different, after all, from anything he was used to. This is making me think a little bit about another Dostoevsky book I read last summer actually, called Notes from a Dead House. That one wasn't really a fictional narrative so much as it was almost an autobiography of sorts. Like, Dostoevsky didn't use his actual name in it, but Notes from a Dead House was very clearly based on his own experiences in Siberia. And that was a very interesting book in its own right. This actually made me think of it a little bit, even though it's not really a prison book. Like, none of it takes place in prison, but many of the moral dilemmas and even some descriptions of prisoners and such in here made me think of that book. And different types of people there are in prison, different types of people there are that go to Siberia. It was also a very good read. She wrote that his health was satisfactory. He went to work, which he tried neither to avoid nor to seek out. He was practically indifferent to food, but since the food was so bad, except on Sundays and holidays, he was finally glad to accept some money from her, Sonia, to buy some daily tea for himself. He begged her not to worry about anything else and made it plain that her fussing over him only annoyed him. Sonia went on to write that he lived in the prison with the other convicts. She had not seen the inside of the prison, but assumed it was crowded, ugly, and unhealthy. He slept over a felt pad on a wooden bunk, and he had no desire to arrange things differently, not because of any preconceived plan or intention, but because he paid no heed and seemed not to care about his lot. Sonia wrote frankly that he not only took no interest in her visits, particularly at first, but seemed almost annoyed with her, was taciturn and even rude in her presence. This is all pretty much the same as Raskolnikov has been throughout the entire book. In the end, however, these meetings became habitual for him and practically a necessity, so he would even feel quite miserable if she took sick for a few days and was unable to visit him. Okay. She would see him on holidays by the prison gates or in the guardhouse, where he would be brought to visit with her for a few minutes. On weekdays, she would see him at work, visiting him either in the workshops or at the brick kilns, or in the warehouses on the bank of the Irtish. About herself, Sonia wrote that she had actually managed to acquire a few acquaintances in town and some patronage. She was doing some sewing, and since there were practically no dressmakers in town, a number of households had already come to rely on her as a necessity. Good for her. I was hoping Sonia would get a happier ending too. This is nice to read. What she did not mention was that through her, Raskolnikov too received some of the privileges of patronage from the authorities, that his work assignments had been eased, and so on. In Sonia's last letters, Dunya had noticed an unusual anxiety and alarm, and finally Sonia wrote that Raskolnikov had estranged himself from everybody. The convicts in his prison did not like him, he was silent for whole days on end, and he was growing very pale. All of a sudden, in her last letter, Sonia wrote that he had fallen quite seriously ill and he was confined in the prisoner's ward of the hospital. Oh my god, is he gonna die? Just of illness and not even suicide after all? Part 2 of the epilogue. He was sick a long time, yet it was not the horrors of convict life, the hard work or the food, or the shaved head, or the ragged clothes which broke him. What did he care about these? On the contrary, the hard work actually pleased him. Yeah, I feel like that fits for some reason. Even though he suffered physically, the work at least earned him several hours of calm sleep. As for the food, the bowls of watery cabbage soup with cockroaches floating in it, I remember this from Notes from a Dead House. What did he care? As a student in the old days, he often had not had even that. His clothing was warm and suited to his kind of life. As for the chains, he actually was not aware of them. Should his shaved head and prison clothes have shamed him? Before whom? Sonia? Since Sonia was afraid of him, why should he be ashamed before her? And yet, why not? He was ashamed even before Sonia, and he made her suffer for it by treating her coarsely and contemptuously. But it wasn't the shaved head and the chains that made him ashamed. His pride was deeply wounded, and it was from wounded pride that he took sick. How happy he would have been if only he could have considered himself guilty. He could have borne all, even the shame and disgrace, and yet, while judging himself severely, even his embittered conscience could find no specially terrible guilt in his past, except for what was simply a blunder, the sort of thing that might happen to anyone. What he was really ashamed of was that he, Raskolnikov, had come to grief so blindly, hopelessly, deftly, and stupidly, by some decree of blind fate, and had to resign himself to such meaninglessness, and make the best of such a decree if he wanted any peace at all for himself. Yeah, even the guilt and tortured conscience we've seen in him throughout this book was very atypical in the sense that it's not like he felt super sorry for the lives that he took. Even Lizaveta, there's maybe one part in the book where he thinks to himself about her, and even that thought is just, wow, I barely think about her at all. I barely even feel sorry about this at all. Isn't that so weird? And that is the closest thing to shame we see from him on account of the actual murders he committed, especially Lizaveta. Most of his shame comes from the fact that he is weak enough to have a tortured conscience at all. A tortured conscience that manifests not so much in thoughts of the people he killed, but just scattered thoughts in general about himself, about his past, about life. Most of his shame comes from the fact that he wasn't able to live up to his theory, not as much guilt about actually killing those people, which is pretty yikes, but it makes him a more interesting character. He's a very human character overall. I'm not saying that the average person is like Raskolnikov, but there are many aspects of him that I don't think are so extraordinary, especially for people living in that time. In the present, anxiety without aim or object. In the future, a perpetual sacrifice productive of nothing. That was what faced him on Earth. And if in 8 years he would be only 32 and could still begin a new life, what difference did it make? What did he have to live for? What could he look forward to? What was he after? Mere existence. He had been ready 1,000 times in the past to stake his existence on an idea, a hope, even a fantasy. Mere existence had always been too small for him. He's such a fucking egotist, dude. He had always wanted something bigger. It may have been only because of the strength of his desires that he had once considered himself a man to whom more was permitted than to others. So okay, he had once considered himself that. It's pretty clear by now that he doesn't think he's one of those types of people anymore. If only he could feel remorse. I find it so interesting that he actually wants to, though. He wants to feel it. Searing remorse, shattering the heart, banishing sleep, the kind of remorse with terrible pangs that conjure up the noose and the whirlpool. He would have rejoiced. Agony and tears, that too is life. But he felt no remorse for his crime. This is fucked up. He might at least rage at his stupidity, as before he had raged at those hideous and stupid acts leading him to prison. Now that he was in prison, however, free, on his own, he re-examined all his former actions, only to find them by no means so hideous and stupid as they had seemed at that fateful time. He thought, in what way was my idea any stupider than the other ideas and theories that have swarmed and clashed in the world, one after the other, since the world began? All you have to do is look at it from a disinterested and completely independent point of view, free of the common preconceptions. And surely if you do that, my idea turns out to be not quite so grotesque. Critics and 5-Kopek philosophers, why stop always halfway? He is such a mess in his thoughts and how they spiral. And my biggest issue with him is that clearly he's not an idiot, he's intelligent in some way, but he keeps talking about these transgressions which some may be permitted in order to introduce a new idea to the world and contribute to the progress of humanity, or at least to their community. And none of his ideas are so systematic or solid as that. It's literally just some people should be allowed to do it. Some people should be allowed to kill, to remove any obstacles that are in their way. But the murders that he commits are so arbitrary and don't contribute anything at all really to the society that he lives in. And he clearly has no ideas of his own, of anything he himself could do to change the world that he lives in. It's just very vague. He's very emotionally driven. Most of his thoughts and explanations of which people are allowed to do this and which are just ordinary, he doesn't clearly outline how to differentiate between the two. It's just a very subjective, emotional evaluation of people that he comes across. There's no specific criteria he ever lists for how you would be able to separate people into these two categories. It's just very self-absorbed, very ill, very irrational despite how eloquently he speaks. It's very interesting to read. Why does what I committed seem so hideous to them? He said to himself. Because it was a crime. What does that word mean, crime? My conscience is at rest. Of course I overstepped illegally. Of course the letter of the law was violated. Blood was spilled. Very well, satisfied the letter of the law. Take my head, why not? And let it go at that. Given that, of course, we have quite a few human benefactors who did not inherit power but seized it for themselves. They should have been executed at their very first steps. But they followed their steps through, and so they were right. Might makes right, huh? And I didn't follow through, so it turns out I did not have the right to permit myself that first step. It was only the sense in which he acknowledged his transgression, simply that he hadn't followed it through, and had gone and confessed. What would following it through have even meant in his situation? Killing more random-ass people? Saving the world that way? He also regretted not having killed himself. Why had he stood overlooking the river and preferred after all to confess his guilt? Was his desire to live so strong? And was it so hard to overcome? Hadn't Svidrigailov, who feared death, overcome that desire? He posed the question in anguish and failed to understand that even as he had looked down into the river, He had perhaps sensed a profound lie within himself and in his convictions. He did not understand that this feeling might have been a token of the future break in his life, of his future resurrection, his future new view of life. He was more inclined to regard it as the mere dead weight of instinct, from which he had been unable to break loose and which he had lacked the vigor to step beyond, because he was weak and worthless. He looked at his fellow prisoners and was amazed at how much even they loved life, how much they treasured it. It even struck him that they valued life more in prison than they had when they were at large. How much agony some of them must have been through. The tramps, for instance. Could an odd ray of sunlight really mean so much? Or the dense forest, or some cold spring in the wilderness, seen once perhaps 3 years ago, and now dreamed of as though of a rendezvous with some beautiful mistress, the green grass around it, and a small bird singing in the bush. Observing further, he noticed still more inexplicable examples. He certainly did not notice much of the life around him in prison, and he did not really want to notice. He lived looking out of the corners of his eyes, so to speak, and he found it loathsome and unbearable to look more directly. Yet he began to feel some surprise finally, when he started noticing, willy-nilly as it were, what before he had not even suspected. What surprised him the most was the terrible, impassable gulf between himself and the others, as if he and they were on different nations. He and they looked at one another distrustfully and with hostility. The main reasons for this cleavage he knew and understood. Yet formerly he would not have admitted these reasons were so profound and powerful. There were also some exiled Poles in the prison, political offenders. They simply considered everybody an ignoramus and a slave and sneered down at everybody from on high. But Raskolnikov could not look at it that way. He saw clearly that these ignoramuses were much cleverer about a lot of things than the Poles. There were also some Russians who held this folk too much in contempt, a certain former officer and 2 seminarists. Raskolnikov clearly noted their mistake. What is this profound reason, he suddenly discovered, as to the gap between him and the others? Everybody disliked and avoided him. Finally, they even came to hate him. Why? He did not know. There were some far more criminal than he, and even these held him in contempt, laughed at him, laughed at his crime. You're a gentleman, they told him. You shouldn't have been walking around with an axe. Not a gentleman's business. Okay, this is reminding me of Notes from a Dead House again, but one of the major barriers that separated the prisoners from each other was the fact that some of them were noblemen or gentlemen or whatever, and others were quote-unquote common folk. And this was a huge point of contempt, especially contempt, I think, from the common folk toward the noblemen, if I remember right. During the second week in Lent, it was his turn to fast, along with the rest of his barracks. With the others, he went to church to pray. For some reason, he did not understand there was a quarrel one day. They all fell on him at once in a fury. You're an atheist, you don't believe in God, they shouted at him. You should be killed. He had never talked to them about God or faith, yet they wanted to kill him as an atheist. He remained silent and did not contradict them. One convict flung himself on him in a real frenzy. Calmly and quietly, Raskolnikov stood his ground. Not an eyebrow twitched and not a face muscle quivered. A guard managed to get between him and the murderer in time, or blood would have been spilled. There was one other question to which he had no answer. Why were they all so fond of Sonia? She did not try to ingratiate herself with them. They saw her rarely, sometimes only at work when she would come for a mere moment to catch a glimpse of him. Nevertheless, everybody knew her, knew she had followed him there, knew how she lived and where she lived. She gave them no money, did nothing special for them. Once only at Christmas, she brought a gift for the whole prison, some pies and some white rolls. Nevertheless, little by little, closer and closer ties were formed between them and Sonia. She wrote their letters for them, mailing them to their kin. Relatives who came to town to visit with them left things and even money for them in Sonia's hands, on the instruction of the convicts. Wives and sweethearts knew her and went to see her. When she came to see Raskolnikov at work, or when she met a party of prisoners on their way to work, they would all take their caps off, and they would all greet her. Sofia Semyonovna, ma'am, you're our tender, aching mother. So spoke these coarse, branded convicts to this tiny, skinny creature. She smiled as she greeted them, and when she smiled at them, they loved it. They loved even the way she walked, and would turn around and watch her go past, and they would praise her. They even praised her for being so small. They didn't know what to praise her for next. When they were sick, they went to her for a treatment. I mean, in general, she does seem like a very compassionate and forgiving person. Like, she is able to condemn things which she judges as immoral, but she seems to have room in her heart for nearly everyone in terms of, like, believing that they can be redeemed I feel like even Raskolnikov sensed that in her, and that's probably why he went to her specifically. Other than the fact, obviously, that she was the daughter of Marmeladov, who was also special to him for reasons. He was in the hospital through Lent and Easter. When he was recovering, he recalled the dreams he had had while still delirious and feverish. While sick, he had dreamed the whole world was condemned to suffer a terrible, unprecedented, and unparalleled plague, which had spread to Europe from the depths of Asia. Except for a small handful of the chosen, all were doomed to perish. A new kind of trichinae had appeared, microscopic substances that lodged in men's bodies. Yet these were spiritual substances as well, endowed with mind and will. I love the description of dreams in this book because I tend to have very vivid dreams myself, and I just like reading about other dreams too. Like the way that they flow, especially when they're very emotionally charged, it's super gripping, very real. Those infected were seized immediately and went mad, yet people never considered themselves so clever and so unhesitatingly right as these infected ones considered themselves. Never had they considered their decrees, their scientific deductions, their moral convictions, and their beliefs more firmly based. Whole settlements, whole cities and nations were infected and went mad. It's like everyone's becoming the Übermensch now, or what he would have described the Übermensch to be like. Everybody was in a state of alarm, and nobody understood anybody. Each thought the truth was in him alone, suffered agonies when he looked at the others, beat his breast, wept and wrung his hands. They did not know whom to bring to trial or how to try him. They could not agree on what to consider evil, what good. They did not know whom to condemn or whom to acquit. People killed each other in a senseless rage. Whole armies were mustered against each other, but as soon as the armies were on the march, they began suddenly to tear themselves apart. Jeez. The ranks dispersed. The soldiers flung themselves upon each other, slashed and stabbed, ate and devoured each other. In the cities, the alarm bells rang for a whole day. Everybody was called, but nobody knew by whom or for what, and everybody was on edge. The most ordinary trades were abandoned because everybody proposed his own ideas, his own criticisms, and they could not agree. Agriculture came to a halt. In some places, knots of people would gather together, reach some agreement, and swear not to separate. No sooner was this accomplished, however, than something quite different from what they had proposed took place. They started accusing each other, fighting each other, and stabbing away. Fires blazed up, hunger set in. Everything and everybody went to wreck and ruin. The plague spread and moved on. In the whole world, only a few people were able to save themselves. The pure and the chosen, predestined to begin a new race of men and a new life, to renew and purify the earth. But these people were not seen anywhere by anybody. Nobody heard their voices or their words. It bothered Raskolnikov that this senseless piece of delirium echoed so mournfully and painfully in his memory, so that for a long time the impression made by these feverish dreams did not pass. Damn, this is an interesting description. By the second week after Easter, warm, clear spring days had come. The windows were open in the prisoner's ward. They were barred and a sentry paced underneath. While he had been sick in the ward, Sonia had only been able to visit him twice. She had to request permission each time, and it was hard to get. But she would come often to the hospital yard and stand beneath the windows, especially in the evening, sometimes merely to stand in the yard for a moment and look at the windows, even if only from a distance. Once, early one evening, Raskolnikov, almost completely recovered, had fallen asleep. When he woke up, he accidentally went over to the window, and suddenly, at the hospital gates in the distance, he saw Sonia. She stood there as if she were waiting for something. At that moment, something seemed to pierce his heart. He shuddered and left the window as quickly as he could. Sonia did not come the next day, or the next, and he noted that he waited for her with anxiety. At last he was discharged. When he got back to the prison, he learned from the convicts that Sofia Semyonovna was ill, home in bed and not going out anywhere. Don't do this. Don't. Just don't. Do not kill Sonia. I'm not talking to Raskolnikov, by the way. I'm talking to Dostoevsky. Do not kill her off. I don't think Raskolnikov is going to kill Sonia. He was very worried and sent for word of her. He soon learned her illness was not dangerous, and when she found out he was worried about her, Sonia sent him a penciled note informing him she was much better, that all she had was an ordinary cold, and that soon, quite soon, she would come see him at work. When he read this note, his heart beat strongly and painfully. The day was again clear and warm. Early in the morning, about 6, he made his way to the river bank to work in a shed where a workshop and kiln for baking and hammering alabaster had been set up. Only 3 workers were sent there. One of the convicts went back to the fortress with a guard for some tool. The other began gathering wood and stuffing it into the kiln. Raskolnikov walked out of the shed to the river bank sat down on some logs piled beside the shed, and looked out over the broad, deserted river. From the high bank a broad vista opened out. A scarcely audible song wafted from the far bank. There, on the boundless steppe, flooded with sunshine, the black dots of nomad tents could barely be seen. There freedom was, and people lived who were quite different from the people on his side of the river. There time seemed to have stood still, as though the age of Abraham and his flocks had not yet passed. Without moving, Raskolnikov sat and looked, his eyes fixed upon the scene. Thought gave way to daydreams, to contemplation. He was not thinking of anything, but a kind of melancholy nagged and disturbed him. Suddenly Sonia appeared beside him. She had approached almost without being heard, and sat down at his side. It was quite early, and the morning chill had not yet lifted. She wore a shabby old burnous and her green shawl. There were still some signs of illness on her face, which had sunken and grown thinner and paler. She gave him a happy, welcoming smile, but as usual, held her hand out to him timidly. She always held her hand out to him timidly. Sometimes she didn't even hold it out at all, as if she were afraid he might reject it. He always seemed disgusted when he took her hand, always met her as though he were annoyed, and sometimes he remained stubbornly silent the whole time of her visit. Sometimes he terrified her, and she went away deeply grieved. But now their hands did not separate. He looked at her swiftly, said nothing, and let his gaze drop to the ground. They were alone. Nobody could see them. The guard had turned away. He did not know himself how it happened, but suddenly something seemed to seize him and hurl him to her feet. He wept and embraced her knees. At first she was terribly frightened, and her face turned completely pale. She jumped up and looked at him and shivered, but at the same time, at that very moment, she understood everything. A boundless joy illuminated her eyes. She understood. For her there was no longer any doubt he loved her. He loved her infinitely. At long last the moment had come. I had a feeling he loved her, despite his various issues and more than one occasion in the story where he felt like his love for her was suddenly giving way to hate. There were similar descriptions used for his feelings toward his family, like Dunya and his mother. But yeah, I think it's pretty obvious he loved her, at least in a Raskolnikov way. The way that Raskolnikov loves people, when he's able to let himself have that feeling for a little bit. He's just very tsundere about it. Imagine writing a book in 19th century Russia, only for someone to call your character a tsundere in 2023. They wanted to say something but could not. Tears came. They were both pale and thin, yet in those pale, sickly faces, there already glowed the light of the renewed future, resurrection to a new life. Love resurrected them, the heart of one contained infinite sources of life for the heart of the other. Alright, this is interesting. I'm not the biggest romance fan in general. I tend to not enjoy romances and stories very much, but I don't think this is written badly at all. And I don't think the idea that some kind of human connection, romantic or otherwise, could somehow soothe or help someone like Raskolnikov, or anyone who's troubled really, is a bad idea in any way. I think it's fairly realistic, and I don't think the build-up to it was bad throughout the book. They resolved to wait and be patient. There were 7 years to go, and until then, how much unbearable pain, what infinite happiness. He knew that he was born again. He felt himself completely renewed in his very being, and she lived only his life. The evening of that very day, with the barracks locked, Raskolnikov lay on his bunk and thought of her. It even seemed to him as if all the convicts who had been his enemies looked at him differently now. He even chatted with them, and they replied politely. Surely that was the way it had to be. Everything had to change now, did it not? He thought of her. He recalled how he had constantly caused her pain. He recalled her pale, skinny little face. These memories did not grieve him now. He knew the infinite love with which he would redeem her suffering. What did they amount to, all those torments? Everything, even his crime, even sentence and exile, seemed to him now, in his first outburst of feeling, strange and superficial. Oh my god, it's the last page. As though it had not actually happened to him. He cannot think very long or steadily about anything that evening or focus his mind on anything, nor did he come to any conscious decision. He had merely become aware. That's an interesting way of wording it. Life replaced logic, and whoa! And in his consciousness, something quite different now had to elaborate and articulate itself. Under his pillow lay the New Testament. He picked it up mechanically. It belonged to her, the one from which she had read him the resurrection of Lazarus. At the beginning of his exile, he had suspected she would bother him with religion, keep talking to him about the Gospels, and shove books at him. To his great surprise, she did not mention such a thing once. and never even offered him the Gospels. He had asked her for the New Testament himself, not long before his illness, and silently she had brought it to him. I guess now he associates it with her or something. Since then he had not even opened it. Nor did he open it now, but he thought, can her beliefs not be mine too? Her feelings and aspirations at least. She too felt agitated all that day, and that night she even took sick again. She was so happy, she was almost frightened of her joy. 7 years, only 7 years. At the beginning, I'm covering the lower part so I don't read it on accident. You know how eyes just wander? At the beginning of their happiness, they were both prepared at moments to look on these 7 years as on 7 days. At the time, he did not know that a new life had not been given him for nothing, that it would have to be bought dearly, that he would have to pay for it with a great deed in the future. That is the beginning of a new story, though. The story of a man's gradual renewal and rebirth, of his gradual transition from one world to another, of his acquaintance with a new reality of which he had previously been completely ignorant. That would make him the subject of a new story. Our present story is ended. Fuck. Alright, I just quickly skimmed like the opening paragraph of the afterword, but I will read that later, so I can share my own thoughts first. That was a lot less depressing than I would have expected, and that's a good thing, actually. I enjoy that. I'm not totally surprised. Like, okay, it's happier, it's more uplifting than I expected, but I'm not totally surprised. Again, because of the compassion I was discussing earlier, that is evident in this story alone, but also in other Dostoevsky writing that I have read before. Without spoiling too much of Notes from a Dead House, in case anyone who is watching this wants to read that, the theme of redemption and rebirth and all of that isn't foreign in his work, not even in this story itself. It doesn't feel unfitting or contradictory to the messages I previously picked up on from this book. Like, there is so much irritation and malice and general unpleasantness in Raskolnikov and how his mind works and how he thinks. But so many of his dreams and so many of his thoughts make it clear that he isn't devoid of love or the ability to empathize with other people, especially his family. Very early on, when he first got a letter from his mother about his sister and the anger he felt when he first learned that she was engaged to Luzin, I think that's how you pronounce it, Loser. I'm just going to call him Loser because he fucking sucked. The rage that he felt on his sister's behalf, and the extent to which he suffers when he thinks that his family is suffering, and the way that he talks to him even when he does the cruelest things to him, like when he's about to leave them, supposedly forever. There are little bits in his actions and the things that he says that makes it obvious hurting them pains him, but he's just so unwell that he cannot treat them decently even amidst these feelings of tenderness that he has for them. I haven't thought about what I was going to say for this video before I started recording, so this is going to be all over the place. It's not structured. I'm just saying what comes to mind in a sort of stream of consciousness, Raskolnikov sort of way, but a recurring theme in this book, obviously, not even just in Raskolnikov, but I guess in Svidrigailov too, notably, the idea of people seeking some sort of peace, some sort of redemption, some sort of way to atone for things. Like, there were so many conversations that Svidrigailov struck up with Raskolnikov that seemed to not be relevant to anything really. It was like he was just talking to him for the sake of talking. It's like he wanted someone to connect with, someone who might be able to relate to him. It's like he was looking for a sense of peace or tranquility that can only really be achieved through connection with other people. And even though it didn't save Svidrigailov in the end, his character was also a pretty good way of conveying that idea. I'm probably going to read like analyses about the book later to see if there's any implications that flew over my head. Like, some things were pretty ambiguous. For example, I'm not sure how much of Svidrigailov's past we were supposed to just guess for ourselves, or whether I'm reading into things too much, but I think there's probably a lot Dostoevsky intended to imply about his past that was never explicitly stated. So we know that he was in love with Dunya, we know about his troubled relationship with his wife and all that. We know he's obsessed with women in general, but some of the dreams that he had towards the end of his story, the end of his life in this book, were very unexpectedly disturbing and made me suspect that he either knew a woman or girl who had been sexually assaulted or even assaulted a woman or girl in that way himself.
Oh my god, bro.
Oh, hell no, man. What the fuck, man? Get your ass.
I mostly say this because of the way he treated Dunya in his last interaction with her. It was one of the most unnerving chapters in the book. And also the fact that both of his dreams had to do with a very young girl suffering in some way. The first one, in which a 14-year-old is lying in a coffin because she could not bear what she had gone through, some kind of violation, which is never really expanded on explicitly, but and the second dream about an even younger girl who flops between asking for help but also infuriating him and having quote unquote a harlot's face at some point, taunting him in a very specific way that I found very disturbing to read about. Just, I don't know, putting all these things together along with other aspects of his personality unsettles me a lot. And I don't know if that's what Dostoevsky was going for. I don't know if it was implied that he had hurt someone that way in the past. But in any case, I think he was an interesting parallel to Raskolnikov, just as another character introduced who has some terrible sin in his past, which he's unable to really come to terms with, and which leads him to behave very sporadically and to speak very incoherently and so on. Clearly there's many differences between their personalities, but they certainly mirrored each other in some ways. As for Raskolnikov himself, I don't know what to say. He's very human, very pathetic, very unlikable in many ways, and yet I did not want to see him die at the end. Like I said, the best I was hoping for is that he would serve time in prison. That would maybe make him calm the fuck down a little bit. I was not expecting him to find this level of peace in his love for Sonia, but that was oddly nice to read about. It didn't feel forced or out of place or anything like that. It was a pretty good way to humble him in a sense and show that he is not above living alongside other people as an equal, at least alongside Sonia as an equal, and maybe spending time with someone who showed belief in his own ability to get better, would nurture his own belief that he is able to improve from his current state. Finally, I was just thinking, what if I had to pick a favorite character for this book? It almost feels superficial to pick anyone other than Raskolnikov, purely because of the amount of time dedicated to him in comparison to the other characters. But at the same time, I don't think the ratio of how much time is spent on Raskolnikov to how much time is spent on others necessarily diminishes the value in how the others are written either. I am going to open up a tier list I just found so that I can rank them and force myself to think about this a little harder. Alright, let's fucking go. We have My Good Friend, Girl Boss, Fine, Not a Fan, and Go to Hell. Another funny thing about this version of the book I'm reading, this translation that I'm reading, and my friend and I have laughed about it quite a bit, but sometimes for emphasis, there would be this weird thing where a certain word is hyphenated and a certain letter is just repeated again and again and again with hyphens in between, like to emphasize the emotion or stress that the speaker is putting into what they're saying. But to me, it didn't necessarily achieve that effect. It just seemed weird. And one of those lines in particular that I remember the most is just to hell with you. It was supposed to come off as very aggressive, but it just sounded weird to me. Anyway, Alyona Ivanovna. I did not like her very much. I mean, not a fan. Or fine. Fine, I guess. I mean, she was pretty petty to Catherine Ivanovna at some point, but Catherine was treating her like shit before she started being petty in return. Overall, she was quite lenient with the family, if I remember correctly, actually. Like, as landladies go. Dunya is so awesome. Girl boss, Dunya is my good friend. Dunya is top tier. Ilya Petrovich, I mean, he's fine. Not a fan. I mean, he's alright. Like, I have no reason to dislike him. He's just not that important. Katerina? I'm guessing this means Catherine Ivanovna. I'm not a fan, personally. I felt sorry for her, but and I know she was really mentally ill and everything. She was destitute, impoverished, and all that, but the way that she treated her kids was fucked up. Lizaveta Ivanovna, she was fine. Here. I like her more than Alyona or Ilya Petrovich. Luzin, go to fucking hell, you bastard. Marmeladov. Honestly, the girl boss thing is throwing me off. I don't know if I'm gonna put anyone in girl boss, but Marmeladov is fine, I guess. And more memorable to me than Lizaveta, so he's going here. Nastasia. It was spelled Nastasia in my version. Anyway, I actually like her quite a bit. She's not that important, but I don't know, she was always really nice and She had a bit of personality too that I enjoyed. Should she be in Girl Boss? Maybe not. I'll just put her in fine for now. I like her more than Marmeladov. Porphyry. Porphyry is my good, or is he a Girl Boss? I like him a lot, but is he top tier up with Dunya? For now, he is going into Girl Boss. Pulcheria. I feel so sorry for her. She's not Girl Boss. She's not my good friend. She's fine. Top of fine. Raskolnikov. Where the fuck do I put Raskolnikov? Um, I'm gonna save him for last. I can't think about this right now. Razumihin is my good friend. Before or after Dunya? Damn. For a long time, he was my favorite. You know what? Yeah, more than Dunya, just a little bit. Sophia or Sonia. So, you know what? Girl boss. She belongs here. More or less than Porphyry. Maybe a bit less. I like her, but there are some things Porphyry said that were like, whoa, really stuck with me. Svidriga love. Oh my god. The thing is, he's a piece of shit in so many ways, and if my suspicions of him if my suspicions about him are correct, that would make him even more shit. So I'm struggling with like how he's written versus how he is as a person. That's the same reason I'm saving Raskolnikov for last. You know what? I'm gonna save both of them for last. Zosimov. I mean, he's okay. He's alright. More important than Ilya, more memorable than Alyona, Lizaveta. I guess here. I'm gonna review this quickly before I change anything, but okay. Shit. Okay, Svidrigailov, I mean, again, I talked about him quite a bit earlier. His inclusion in the story is pretty good. He's not like one of the best written characters I've ever seen, though, so that's not really predominating my thoughts about him right now. And I think that maybe some scenes with him were even maybe a little too long-winded. He's either fine or not a fan, probably. Let me see, go to hell is Lucy, not a fan, Katerina. Fuck, where do I put him? My battery is like about to die. I have to put him somewhere. And in the end, he did financially contribute in ways that were very helpful to Catherine's kids, Sonia's siblings. Like I'm leaning toward putting him in fine, ass end of fine because of his past and some horrible things that we know he has done and that he might have done. But at the same time, it looks weird to see him behind someone as unimportant as Ilya Petrovich. Like, I don't know, because I feel like the worst thing that he's ever done, like, is probably not
Worse
as
than.
bad as the worst thing that Catherine has ever done, especially if I'm right about what I think he probably did. But at the same time, I don't know if I'd put them in the same tier, because most of the time that Catherine spoke in the story, I was just very annoyed by how she spoke. Like, she's very insufferable to listen to. Again, I know it's caused by illness and everything, but the way she talked and rambled and especially treated her children was just super hard to read, which why I have to put her in that tier. As for Svidrigailov, I do not feel that same annoyance when he spoke. I was more just kind of casually interested in what he had to say. Again, sometimes it was only a little annoying because of how long-winded it was, but I appreciated how like calm he was most of the time. And it's also worth noting that most of what we see in him is after he has mellowed out from whatever he used to be in the past. So that is more of what I have to judge him off of. I think ultimately trying to avoid overthinking and just go with my gut, I'm gonna put him in fine, maybe right after Marmeladov, because everything that comes after that, they're so unimportant comparatively to the story. It just feels weird to put him behind any of them. Now for our boy. Where the hell do I put Raskolnikov? Oh god. Definitely not and not a fan, because as irritating and unlikable as he is sometimes, he's just very well written. I enjoyed reading about him a lot. Not fine, not a girl boss, not even my good friend. I would not be friends with Raskolnikov. Or at least not in the traditional sense of the word, but maybe I should just seriously, I can't even put him back. I will make a new tier just for him. Add a row above. Raskolnikov. Laughing my fucking ass off. I don't want to imply anything about whether he is better than Razumikin or Dunya. Like, these three are my favorites, I think. Porphyry comes close, but I still think I prefer Dunya, Razumikin, and Raskolnikov, all of them, to Porphyry by some amount, but would it look better like this? Or like this? I don't know. I think I'm just gonna settle for leaving it at this. I enjoyed Raskolnikov, Razumikin, and Dunya more than anyone else in the story. This is my way of expressing that. Porphyry and Sonia were very enjoyable as well. Finalist is quite memorable as well, all the way up until Zosimov, at which point, honestly, they're not that memorable to me. Catherine is very memorable. Irritated me too much for me to put her in another tier other than what I put her in. Very well written character though. And Luzin, oh my god, is also very well written. There are many people like him in real life, but I want to kick him in the shin so fucking bad. But yeah, this is my final tier list for Crime and Punishment characters. That was a very enjoyable book overall. I had a lot of fun reading it. I like narratives that go really deep into the mind of, let's just say, some pretty fucked up people. And I can see why some people would not enjoy a book like this purely for its pacing and how much it just goes round and round in Raskolnikov's head throughout the pages. It's very repetitive, but I think that captures the state of mind that people like that are in really well. To me, it wasn't gratuitous. I can read a lot of that kind of shit and not get bored. I'm like really fascinated by that sort of thing. So personally, I think it was a very well written book. Very raw, very rough, very sincere somehow. I don't know which parts of Dostoevsky were in the book, like which parts of himself maybe he projected into the book, but it feels like it came from somewhere very real. Or maybe things that he observed in others. I'm sure that shows up in all of his work, but it was honestly a joy to read for that simple reason. That someone was clearly trying to communicate something very emotionally profound and authentic in the form of this narrative, and have it end with something relatively hopeful, at least compared to everything that came before it in the story. I'm trying very hard right now to compulsively stop myself from speaking about Monster, because I'm being reminded of Monster a lot right now as I talk about this. But yeah, there's so many tropes here and ways of storytelling here that happen to be ones I really enjoy. And I'm pretty sure that's why my best friend recommended it to me in the first place. A very good recommendation. Thank you so much. If you are watching this, happy belated birthday again, and reminder again to reread this so we can talk about it more. Take care everyone, and I will see you guys next time.